Today is Friday, July 2nd, and earlier this week I published a talk on Christianity and the natural law, where I criticized Christians who go around in political discussions talking about the natural law, and I explained that contrary to what Christians copy and paste all over the internet, and I say copy and paste because very few Christians actually read the sources they pull quotes from. Many of them are not even pulling quotes from the sources, they're pulling quotes from websites, and they just pass them around to give themselves an appearance of learning as if they're actually reading those sources. I often call them out on their quotes and prove that they have never read the books that they're quoting from, or that the quotes aren't even real, and anyone who would read the sources of the quotes would know that they're not anything that those people would ever have said. And this lazy quote pasting culture is quick to run into all kinds of controversies, and they love to take hold of terms that make them appear to be well-informed and carefully researched, but when they're pressed, we find that what they're saying makes no sense at all. And so I said that in order to take up some controversial topical issues in modern society, we first have to address a couple of faults in modern Christian thinking. And I named a couple of them in that talk on Christianity and the natural law. Today I'd like to take up one of those topics. It's very important topic in our generation. I've been forced to deal with it. I've intersected with it at a few different points in my life, a few different reasons why I've had to deal with it, and I think that it's another one of these areas where Christians are quick to start copying and pasting things and hypocritically speaking against things with a giant log in their own eye, which prevents them from reasoning, which prevents them from actually doing God's will. And that's the topic of homosexuality. It's a controversial topic for two reasons, I think. First of all, it's an issue that many Christians who are eager to get into politics don't struggle with, and therefore it's easy for them to talk about. Maybe just one reason, really. It's easy for them to talk about because of hypocrisy. And it's easy to condemn people who struggle with sins that we don't struggle with. It's easy for a skinny man to condemn gluttony and talk about how terrible gluttony is, when he himself may not even be interested in eating. It's easy for a man who doesn't like sleeping to condemn sloth. It's easy for a married man to condemn homosexuality. And this is one of the reasons why it's a hot topic, why homosexuality is demonized as it is. But I think if we are willing to analyze the issue, we find that when we ask some questions and think rather than speak, or rather than merely copy and paste things that other people have said, it's not such a simple topic, and we need to really make some important clarifications to avoid saying stupid things that actually push people further into error and cause them to think that the error may be true because of the ridiculous things that people say who contradict it. Now, I said that I've had a few run-ins with the topic of homosexuality in my life. The first came when I was a child. One of my cousins, an adult cousin, I was told was a homosexual, and I remember being with him at family reunions and things like that, and that was my first and maybe only exposure to homosexuality as a child. One of my cousins, and he was a cool guy. I didn't know anything about him until my mother told me, but I later learned more about him and even had a few conversations with him as an adult. So that was my first experience with homosexuality, just learning about it through my cousin. My second run-in with homosexuality came when I was in college. I was a leader of a Christian fellowship group on campus at Rutgers University, and our group used to get together in the middle of the week. I think it was Thursday nights, and we'd get together with all the Christians on campus would gather together, and we'd hang out for an evening, take a break from our studies, have a little bit of a Bible study, talk about the faith, and develop friendships with other Christians on campus, have some snacks together, just hang out and relax and enjoy good Christian fellowship with other students. And we met in a room in the student center on College Ave, which is the main strip through the Rutgers campus, and right across the hall from the room we met in was the meeting place of Big LaRue, which was the bisexual, gay, and lesbian at Rutgers University group. And so they met right across the hall from us, and I started talking to the leaders of their group because we'd see each other week by week. And those discussions that we had spilled over into email correspondence, and so I got to get to know a couple of intelligent, relatively friendly, homosexual students while I was at Rutgers, and learned a lot about the ideas that they talk about and their experiences and things like that. So I had a run in there back in college. Recently, I've had to address this issue as a parent. My eldest daughter, who is a beautiful, healthy, smart girl who works in healthcare, joined the Army Reserves as a medic, made a lot of friends while doing so, has started to talk about these things, ask questions about these things. And so I've had to take up these discussions as a father. And recently I've had a couple of contacts ask me if I'd be willing to get into this issue as they've had experience themselves with family members or children. And it's a controversial topic. And there are also mixed messages, it seems, at times from the clergy and the church. And so it gets confusing. And what I'd like to do during this talk, hopefully it won't run too long, but I'd like to reflect on this question of homosexuality and try to help Catholic people Catholic lay people think through it a bit and avoid falling into extreme errors which do no good. Now, I'd like to start the discussion, or where I would even start my own thinking, is by just nailing down some essentials, some principles. Because like St. Thomas Aquinas says, if two people are going to have a discussion on some controversial issue, and they can't agree on any principles, then they really have no grounds on which to have a discussion. And so I'm going to propose a few principles that I would require for one of these discussions. And if any of these were rejected by another person, well, then we'd have to start over again in our discussion and see if there was some other principle we could agree on that would allow us to build a profitable discussion with at least some point of agreement that we could take for granted and reason from. Now, just to explain something else, what St. Thomas taught is that when there are no principles on which we can agree, then what we can do, which is what Socrates often did, is simply demonstrate that the other person's position is impossible, usually by means of leading them into contradiction. So in order to argue anything and lead to some truth, we have to have some common ground, some common principle. And if there's no principle that we can agree on, then we can at least state our case and see if our case can be proven impossible. So as for my principles on this question of homosexuality, and this is just basic, my starting principle will be that God created the world. That the world, the heavens and the earth were created by God, that human beings and all plants and animals were created by God. I would request that this be granted as a principle on which a discussion would be based. And so I'd be talking to Christian people. If I was asked to speak to someone who wasn't a Christian, then I would move to some philosophical principle, such as the Epicurean or Aristotelian idea of the law of nature. Again, not as I explained its false use by Christians who are politically minded talking about natural law, but a philosophical and moral discussion that uses nature as a principle of agreement. But anyway, for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to limit my talk to what I would expect to be a Christian discussion. Let's say this is a discussion within the Catholic community, among people who on this topic may not agree. I would say we have to begin with the assumption, or the belief, that God created the world. This is an article of faith, straight from the creeds of the Church. It's something that we can't claim to be Catholic and disagree on this point, and therefore we can begin with an assumption that God created the world. The reason why I would like to start with that assumption is because there's a dilemma right at the beginning which is, if God did not create the world, if there is no God, if God did not create the world, then we're simply animals. And if we're simply one more species of animal with no transcendent purpose that distinguishes us from all other species of animals, then there really will be no grounds for any moral argument, because we'll often find that people who are supportive of homosexuality will turn right around and condemn some other moral behavior as if the reason why one is okay and one is not okay is self-evident, when it's not self-evident. Something is assumed in the condemnation of one type of behavior that's simply ignored or justified in another kind of behavior. So, if we're simply animals, then the whole discussion is over. And you have this irrational, crazy attempt to claim that we're mere animal species, and then the person will turn right around and start talking about rights and politics as if that makes any sense for a race of animals. And this is the beginning of these contradictions whenever we're dealing with a false position. They quickly run into contradiction because they have no real principle. So we'd assume that God created the world. We'd assume that we're not mere animals. And then we'd simply ask, if God created us, if our life is given to us by a creator, then that creator has the right to tell us what to do. He has the right to declare one thing to be good and one thing to be evil. Some people ask a good question, is a thing good because God commands it, or does God command a thing because it's intrinsically good? What actually makes something good or evil? It's a good question. I like to say that a thing is good because God wills it. Because as the creator, God has the right and authority to do whatever he pleases. He could destroy us and it would be just. He could fill the whole world with diseases and it would be his right. He's the creator. He gives life and he can take life away. And there's nothing that we can say. So I would argue that because God is the creator of the world, he has the right to tell us what we're to do. He has the right to reward us for doing his will, if he wills. And he has the right to punish us for not doing his will, if he wills. And then we simply can move on to the question, has God revealed his will concerning sexual relations? Has God revealed his will? Now, the reason why I start with creation and this question of God's will is because I believe that if we have an honest discussion about these issues and we rely on natural arguments to say this is good, this is bad, this is natural, this is not natural, I think we're going to run into some real troubles. I don't believe that that's the right approach to the question of homosexuality. And I think that most Christians take that line of argument and it doesn't work, which is why homosexuality is becoming more and more widely accepted. And as we see in many issues, the Christians present weak arguments and lose relatively easy disputes. I think the argument from nature is very weak, and let me explain why. First of all, we have to realize that when we talk about homosexuality, we're talking about a spectrum of behavior. And at some point, we have to decide where the line is to be drawn that separates acceptable behavior from sin. If we draw that line anywhere but exactly in the right place, we'll run into all kinds of ridiculous arguments. And this is what Christians often do. For example, in my family, men showed almost no affection to other men. In my family, the men were working men. Every male played sports. And so a sign of affection might be a high five or a fist bump or a handshake. That was it. That was affection between me and my grandfather. Handshake. Maybe a noogie on the head or a Charlie horse. That was affection. There was no physical signs of affection. At the same time, while I was working this afternoon, I had a soccer match on TV in the background. Italy was playing Belgium. And it's funny to watch the Italians, these big, muscular, athletic men, celebrate with kisses and hugs, patting each other's cheeks, very affectionate. Now, in my family, if anyone did that, he'd get his head chewed off. He'd get hit with all kinds of crude remarks, because that level of physical affection is considered gay in the family I grew up in. I remember my 7th grade woodshop teacher, who was a big, rough guy, old guy. One day, my friend and I were goofing around in class, and he looked at us and said, "What are you, fags?" It's that sort of old American anti-homosexual spirit that I'm accustomed to. I grew up around and in. And even to watch an Italian soccer team kiss one another after a goal, grab each other by the face and by the neck, it's an affection that to me is odd, and yet in Italian culture is absolutely normal, perfectly normal. And so we could see that it starts to get difficult to draw lines and say, where exactly does affectionate behavior become sinful? And we can run to extremes, and that's pretty easy. We can run to extremes. We can say, okay, well, this act and this act are sin. Okay. That's fine, but the problem is we're going to find that many people who claim to be homosexuals and have same-sex relationships don't necessarily engage in those acts. And so if that's the definition, this particular act is sin. What will we do with all of the other affectionate acts? Where will we draw the line? If the line is going to be drawn in an extreme place, we're going to find that many who speak about homosexuality don't even do those things. And so we're going to find that that isn't a sufficient answer when a question comes up like, can two men marry or enter into some kind of recognized legal union? The natural argument is going to run into problems. Now, Catholics will respond, rightly so, and say things like marriage is for one man and one woman. It's for life. They may continue and say marriage is made official or realized by sexual activity, and that sexual activity must have intent for reproduction, must be reproductive. And so now we'll have 4 or 5 different characteristics that become essential for marriage, and we'll argue that because homosexuals can't fulfill these criteria, they should not be allowed to marry. And the homosexuals will look at the Catholics arguing these things and say, we're not even talking about that. We don't even care about your holy matrimony. We're talking about a civil union for the sake of temporal benefits. Benefits like being able to have your health insurance at work cover your partner because he's legally recognized as a partner, some kind of committed partner. Tax issues. If I file my taxes and I file as one who's married, filing jointly and enjoy benefits, a homosexual couple may say, we'd like to know if we can also have those benefits. We'd like to marry, we'd like to file our taxes as married filing jointly. And the Catholics would object and say, well, no, it's not right that you have these benefits because there are reasons for these benefits. There were causes that led to these benefits being made available. For example, it's assumed that when we talk about a married couple, we're often talking about a single income family. A family that has to bear the expenses of raising American citizens in their home. And so the government will say, yes, you're right. Because you're doing the work of providing for and raising dependent American citizens, your own children, we're going to give you these tax benefits, these child tax credits, all these different benefits that allow you to save on your taxes if you are married and file the right way. And we'll say that's the cause of these benefits. They're not just random, they're intended to help the family because the family, especially the head of the household, has to bear a heavy burden, and the tax laws lighten that burden on a man who may make the same income as another man, but what he does with that income is completely different. He's not buying himself second and third cars and jet skis and designer suits. He's buying his kids groceries, paying for their school tuition, and so on. Two very different situations. And so the Catholics will object and say a homosexual couple shouldn't have these benefits because they don't fulfill the conditions that led to the creation of these benefits. So it's not right. But then here's where the trouble comes. The homosexuals can turn around and point to 1 million American families, married couples, not living like this family is supposed to live. The wife is a professional. She's on birth control. She has no children, or she has one child. But she's been on birth control for 25 years. She's had no other children. And yet she gets the tax benefits. They get these tax benefits, and they're not living the life that the Catholics are describing. And all of a sudden, there's a real monkey wrench thrown into this argument. Because the homosexuals wouldn't be the first group of people to receive these benefits without satisfying the criteria which is being argued originally led to the creation of these benefits. And so now, because the American public has been allowed for 50 years to marry, use contraception, not reproduce, and get all of these benefits, all of a sudden this argument, when thrown at the homosexual community, becomes an example of real discrimination. The homosexuals will call it such. They'll say that this is discrimination. You're allowing this group of people to enjoy this benefit, and you're denying this group of people access to this benefit. And so your principle is not sincere, it's not real. It's just a matter of convenience for you. It's a way that you discriminate against our homosexual community. And they're right. And this is why when these cases go to court, or when these things go up for election, and everyone gets a chance to present their case, this is why they win. Because for 50 years, 100 years, people looked the other way. As heterosexuals lived contrary to God's will, and now, all of a sudden, that's come back to bite them. They got caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Now, what happens is, we turn around and we say to these contracepting heterosexual couples, you know what? We were wrong. You guys need to stop this stuff. You shouldn't have these benefits. You shouldn't be filing your taxes as a married couple, claiming marriage benefits when both of you are working full-time as professionals with no children to care for. It's not right what you're doing. Well, these heterosexual couples are now going to have a choice. They can either continue to live the way they're living and simply side with the homosexuals politically and economically, or they can choose to change their whole lifestyle so that the Christians can win this political argument. It's pretty simple to guess which course they're going to choose. They're going to choose to just side with the homosexuals politically, grant the same rights to the homosexuals, and continue to enjoy those rights themselves. So the Christian argument is not going to work. It's going to backfire and just lead the heterosexual couples who are also living unnaturally to just side with the homosexuals. And this is why the natural argument doesn't work. It doesn't work. If laws, for example, in the old days there were sodomy laws, laws that made unnatural sexual acts illegal and criminalized and punished those who participated in them. Normally, these laws are spoken of in the context of homosexuality. And so sodomy laws become really just a term that's used to express anti-homosexual laws. And yet that's not what the laws are about. But because this unnatural sexual activity has been allowed among heterosexual people, because a great proportion of Christians can be proven to be admirers of the pornographic culture, the homosexuals have another easy political victory. Because these sodomy laws are again being used as a way of discriminating against one group of people. And so they win again. And this is why in our society, all of these kinds of laws have been removed in most places, and why politically the homosexuals win dispute after dispute after dispute. It's because this argument from nature is not going to work when it's applied at Christians' convenience. By not maintaining true Christian moral standards, the Christians have prepared a bed for themselves and now they have to lay in it. They're going to pick this sin but not that sin, this example but not that example, and they think that they're so clever that they're going to get away with it until the end comes and God traps them. And that's what we see in American society. And so we see that this insincere appeal to nature, which is used by Christians at their convenience to criticize homosexuals, is not going to work. If I wanted to play devil's advocate, I could easily tear apart a Christian attempt to appeal to some rule of nature when trying to forbid gay marriage or homosexual activity. The nature argument will only reveal hypocrisy, which politically is discrimination. And that's why I don't believe that Christians should make an attempt in this society We should not make an attempt to argue from nature in politics, because those are losing arguments. In fact, I believe that all Catholic arguments politically are going to be losing arguments, because the views of true Catholic faith and morals are not those of the American people. We should get used to the reality that Catholic faith and morals in political circles are losing arguments. Now what you see is our biggest problem is that because in past generations Christians accepted standards that were not God's will, but even worse, because modern Christians believe that they have a right to create some kind of theocracy in democratic society and live in a culture where disobedience to their religion is punished by the government. We just have this nonsense political culture among Christians. They can't say two things in a row that make any sense. The positions contradict one another from one topic to the next. They lose on all sides. Even though their positions, generally speaking, should be stronger, by the time the modern Christians are done with them, and they have to run them through these machines that basically make them ridiculous, because Christians don't go into these discussions with freedom and sincerity and honesty. They're always trying to cover certain pet sins, and so all their positions are very fragile. They've always got skeletons in the closet. They're always walking on eggshells. And they've got to be very careful, because they're not sincerely going after God's will. They're just trying to go after God's will or use God's will as an excuse to control this or that issue for their own temporal benefit. And they get caught doing this, and this is why they lose politically, and why they've really become a laughing stock in modern society. Everyone can see through it, but the Christians lack the self-awareness to realize that they're like the person who comes out of the bathroom with toilet paper hanging out of his pants. Everyone's laughing at him, and he thinks nothing's wrong. But everyone can see through this fake political Christianity. And that's why it loses. Now, I don't believe that political action is reasonable for Christian people. This is one of the chief points on which I disagree with most modern Christians, and I get attacked for it on a daily basis. If you want to maintain a true Christian position on a moral issue, you need to forget about politics. Because as I said, the position is not going to be popular. It's not going to win an election. Christian morals, first of all, they're not going to be popular because they require grace, even to desire. And then much more, they require grace to actually live and practice. So if you want to be a quote-unquote faithful Catholic, you need to abandon any hope of political action. Because all political action is about popularity contests. This is why we have Christians settling into the party system telling people that our goal or duty as citizens is to vote for the lesser of two evils, which is completely false. No Christian has any obligation to ever do so. It's an election. The whole point of an election is that we're supposed to vote according to our conscience, not according to what candidates happen to have been appointed by the two popular political parties. Both of these parties, or I should say neither of these parties, represents Christianity. This is why the Catholic Church receives so much criticism, why the bishops are so constantly criticized in political circles. They're hated by both parties. The Catholic bishops are hated by the Democrats because they don't support socialist ideas, they don't support abortion, and so they get ridiculed and criticized by the Democrats. And then at the same time, the bishops get criticized and ridiculed by the Republicans because they don't just jump on board with the Republican Party platform, which seeks to use the government as a hammer to enforce some, but not all, Christian ideas. That's really the fault of both parties. They both seek to weaponize the government to punish some, but not all, behaviors that they don't like or that contradict the Christian faith, to enforce some, but not all, Christian moral principles. And the truth is found in the bishops who stand in between the two parties in a sort of political limbo, which is where we'll always find the Catholic faith to be. The golden mean, the balance between these two opposite extremes. And so there's usually not a candidate for the Catholic to vote for. And then some make an attempt to argue that this one issue or that one issue should be the defining issue. And those are all controversial issues, and the arguments for them are usually very poor. But the reality is that our political votes are a political right. Voting is not mandatory. The Constitution doesn't mandate that all citizens vote. And therefore, there's simply nothing that can be said. When we look at the election results, we find that our ignorant society divides into two giant parties with almost the same number of votes on each side, which is very strange. I believe it's an act of God's providence to protect us. We'll find that there are 60-something million Republican votes for president, 60-something million Democrat votes for president, and the difference in the election comes down to the electoral college numbers. As I said, I believe, my personal belief is that God actually uses this division to create a stable society that Christians, true Christians who actually seek to do His will, can live in peacefully, because they're actually protected by both sides of the two-party system. The two parties fight against each other and end up balancing the ship that the Christians live comfortably on. Those who get caught up in the party politics make themselves miserable and prove that they really don't even understand how American government works, that it was designed with these checks and balances built into the system to create a stability. And any wise man would know that that stability that's created by the checks and balances is where a man can enjoy a happy life. Any man who gets caught up into one of the sides of the two extremes will be miserable because he doesn't understand the nature of the society that the founding fathers pretty wisely created. Life in the middle is peaceful. Like a man standing on a ship or standing on a seesaw where both sides go up and down violently, and yet where he stands is calm. So I think that all of this political quarreling, it's just wrangling. There's no real principle in it. If Christians want to get involved in that, they prove themselves to not be what Aristotle would call elegant in mind. They prove themselves to be vulgar, caught up in the bread and circuses, as it were. And yet they all imagine themselves to be the civilized ones as they pull their hair out in the battle between the two news media networks that represent the two parties. It's pretty ridiculous to watch and listen to and read about. So if Christians want to be sincere, I think the first thing they need to do is withdraw from the two-party political system and actually go back and do what Jesus wisely told them to do. Jesus never presented us with any political mission, didn't define any party platform for us, didn't teach us the art of campaigning, wasn't popular himself, never won a political office. When offered political offices, he turned them down. And he said explicitly, "My kingdom is not of this world." He said, if my kingdom were of this world, my friends or my disciples would be fighting. The assumption there, of course, is that the Christians are not engaged in political fights. My kingdom is not of this world, he said. He didn't teach us to be political activists. What he taught us was to be evangelists. Just like he was an evangelist. In the Gospels, we read him teaching as a religious teacher. We find him having discussions with individuals, Nicodemus at night, the woman of Samaria at the well. We find him speaking privately with individuals and telling them, as individuals, to follow him. He calls them individually to repent and believe the gospel. Promises them benefits individually, comforts them individually, challenges them individually. And some follow him individually. And this is the work that he teaches his disciples to do. This is the mission he sends his disciples on. He says, go into the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Trinity, and teach them to obey all that I've commanded. Notice his commands are to be taught to those who have become his disciples, who have been baptized, who are living in his grace. We're not to go into the world and teach unbelievers to obey all that Christ has commanded. That's not even what Christ said to do. That itself is an act of disobedience. Jesus said, go into the world as Christians, as religious people, as individuals, and make individual disciples. He taught his apostles very clearly what to do. He told them to go into a city, preach the gospel to the people in that place, and if the people reject it, he told them to pack up their stuff and move to the next city. And where people received the message, we see in the book of Acts that they established churches in those places, baptized those people, and then taught them to observe all that Christ commanded. The communities of believers were voluntary communities. They did not enforce the rules or teaching of the apostles by government power. It was a spiritual community. It was a voluntary community. That's how the world is changed. It's changed through evangelization, through education. The first goal is to make disciples of other people, of our neighbors, of our co-workers, of our own children. To make disciples. To initiate them into the sacramental life of the church, through which the graces of God are given to men. And then, standing and living in that grace, to teach them to observe all that Christ has commanded. That's the Christian life. It's not a political organization. Its method is not through political action or protest, not by calling senators and marching in the streets and demanding that legislators do this or that. It's personal evangelization, disciple making. Now, once we've established that, when I come face to face with a person who claims to be a homosexual, and I phrase it in that way because I believe that many of these people are just confused souls who are being told by a perverted society that they are members of a certain class because this or that characteristic appears to be present in them. I believe that that's not even true. Many of these people are told to call themselves homosexuals and are brainwashed into imagining that they actually are something just because they have one or two or a few characteristics which aren't even essential to homosexuality. But many of these people are just confused. Now, if we come into contact with a person who claims to be a homosexual, we should have one concern as Christians. We shouldn't talk about marriage. We shouldn't be concerned about their moral behavior. If they're not even Christians, if they don't live in the grace of God, our only concern should be to evangelize them, to preach the gospel to them. Because if they receive the gospel through faith, which is a gift of God. It's a divine gift. You never know how a person will respond to the gospel. Faith is a gift. When I was 17 years old, no one would have imagined that if they would have shared the gospel with me, a smart aleck, foul-mouthed punk playing baseball and basketball in central New Jersey, no one would have ever imagined that that punk kid was actually ready to receive the gospel. No one would have ever imagined, because no one knew my secret thoughts. No one knew what I thought about at home, sitting in my bedroom or laying in my bed alone. No one knew those thoughts except for God, who told all of his Christian followers to go and preach the gospel to me. And finally, when one of them did, I received the gospel and I believed by God's grace, and my whole life changed. When we meet someone in the world who's an unbeliever outside of God's grace, no matter what they say about themselves, no matter what comes out of their mouth, no matter what we see on their face, no matter what clothes they're wearing, we don't know how God has worked within them to orchestrate their experiences, what grace God has given them or will give them. And we're not to judge. We're to preach the gospel and to know that God, or that Jesus Christ, we could say, came into the world to save sinners. And so our first concern should not be our political ambitions. Our first concern should not be how it will affect our taxes. Our first concern should be to obey Christ and preach the gospel. And by a sincere testimony of our own lives of charity and humility, confessing that we ourselves are saved by grace and not by any strength of our own, we might find that's all that person needs to be completely transformed. And that's the case of many people. Not only those who claim to be homosexuals, but any sin. St. Paul talks about this in his epistles. He says, some of you were homosexuals, some of you were fornicators, idolaters, on and on. Some of you were, he says, but you were washed. And that Christian community that St. Paul spoke to and wrote to, he could remember the day when he met those people in the streets. He can remember what they were doing. He probably remembers how many of them were dressed, where he first met them, what their first response was. And he looks at them now, years later, and when they hypocritically judge others, he could say to them, you were such as these. And as Christians, if we're not sincere, if we're ungrateful, and we don't reflect on our own life before Christ's, we'll often think that our salvation or our state of life or our quality of life is owed to our own strength or our own decisions that we made with our own free will But we'll find that that's rarely ever the case. We have free will, but God's grace is often irresistible. So our first concern in this whole discussion about homosexuality is to see that we preach the gospel to any person who claims any kind of anti-Christian sentiment or behavior, to give God the chance to convert that person by doing our work of preaching the gospel. How many Christians do that? Do you do that? When was the last time that rather than arguing with someone about a political position or a law, you asked yourself, wait a minute, is this person in the grace of God? Has this person been born again? What am I doing yelling at him about Christ's commandments when he's not even baptized? He's not even a Christian disciple. Why am I yelling at him about Christ's commands? How many times have you first led someone into the church before you started talking politics? If you do it the other way around, you shouldn't be surprised that you fail so often. So our first concern should be their conversion and salvation. Politics are irrelevant. Politics are matters of money, physical, living conditions. Politics are not real. They're not eternal. Nothing substantial. You're just fighting over junk in political arguments. So we should be concerned with preaching the gospel, with evangelizing our neighbors and leading them into the grace of the gospel, into the sacramental life, into the church. Now, we'll often find that most Christians have become very fluent, very articulate in all of their political talk. They've got the memes and quotes all lined up like ammunition ready to go. But ask them a question about the gospel, and you'll find that they're clueless. One time, a few years back, a man said that he was a Christian missionary and was seeking to raise funds for a mission project. It was on a forum that I hosted. And so all the Christians, as usual, jumped in with all their positive responses. And I asked, do you know what the gospel is? And as soon as I asked that, everyone started to yell at me that I was mean, that I was this and that, because I would embarrass someone who claimed to be a missionary by asking if he knew what the gospel was. And it turned out that this man was sincere enough and real enough to admit that the cart was getting ahead of the horse and that he didn't actually know the gospel and that he was doing things backwards. And I trust that he took the time and made the effort to actually figure things out so that he could pursue missionary activity with some real purpose as a Christian and not just be busy with projects. The same problem is found in politics. We find Christians eager to run, eager to go and attend the march, eager to go and stand on the sidewalk and pray the rosary against this, as if the rosary is some kind of laser gun you shoot at people. I always wonder, when people pray the rosary as a political weapon, are they meditating on the mysteries? That's the whole point of the rosary. I don't know how it turns into some sort of spiritual machine gun. I don't understand that. But instead of running to the next political event, it'd be good to find out if you even know what the gospel is. And to ask yourself if it's even reasonable or possible for people to choose God's ways before they've been initiated into the Christian faith. Ask yourself whether your political action and zeal actually deny the reality of the gospel, and that without the grace of Christ, no one can be saved. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Does your political action, does your political arguing, your bumper stickers, your Facebook posts, your memes, do they even make sense in light of the gospel? Or have you just become one of these mindless copying and pasting robots? Our first concern should be the conversion of individual souls. Because guess what? If a person is converted and becomes a Christian, receives the grace of God and begins to learn and obey the teachings of Christ, guess what? His voting will take care of itself. His conversion will teach him how to vote. You won't have to scream him down into yielding to the pressure of the Republican political party. If there is a true political position, a converted man being led by the Spirit of God will vote appropriately. And it's none of your business. Your job is to preach the gospel, to make disciples. And if you want to judge your success, you should ask yourselves, how many people have you led to baptism? Because that's your actual duty as a Christian. You bring your children to baptism. You don't start screaming at your children before they're baptized. You bring your children to baptism and you understand that that's step one. But then when your neighbor walks up with tattoos on his face and an earring through his eyeball, or whatever the latest fad will be, you think to argue with him over his politics, or argue about his tattoos, or talk to him about his sexual orientation, and not about baptism. You wouldn't do that with your own children, because it wouldn't make sense. And yet you do it with your neighbor, which makes just as little sense. Now, I'm sorry, it sounds like a Noah's Ark out here. We're watching my daughter's dogs for a week, and I've got some cows and horses running in for feeding time right now. But anyway, when we meet someone in the world who is living contrary to God's will, living contrary to nature, we shouldn't think that we're normal and they're strange. We should think rather that they're normal and we're strange. We're the ones who are different. We're the ones who are living unnaturally, in the sense that the morals that we seek, if we seek them sincerely, are not natural, but supernatural. And we shouldn't expect our neighbors to live like us when we claim to be born again. We claim to be children of God. We claim to have the Holy Spirit dwelling in us. We claim to have access to the graces of the sacraments. We claim to have supernatural virtues infused into our souls by God. And then we act as if our neighbors who have none of these things should act like us, dress like us, live like us, have relationships like us. Is that reasonable? That's not reasonable. We shouldn't expect a non-Christian to live like a Christian. And non-Christians should look at Christians and say, wow, we can't live like them. We can't do what the Christians do. Our ways are inferior to their ways, not because the government gives them artificial political benefits, but because they enjoy real, moral, spiritual, intellectual, practical benefits that can't be counterfeited and that unbelievers can't reproduce or copy. That's what should argue our position against our neighbors. But what you will often find is the opposite is the case. The homosexuals look at the Catholic community and find divorce all over the place. The Catholics are found to be watching pornography just like everyone else. The Catholic kids are found to be doing all the same stuff that the unbelievers' kids are doing. The same problems are present in the Catholic churches and schools that are present in the public schools. So should we expect non-Christians to think that their way needs to be repented of and abandoned? What alternative is there for them? To join the Christians who do all the same things, or who simply exchange one sin for another? If we can't show them a better way, like St. Paul said, a more excellent way, if we can't show them a better life, not one that's just better because it's our way, but one that's objectively, truly, demonstrably better. A life that unbelievers do not have the power to enjoy because they live without the grace of God, without the light of sacred scripture and the Catholic faith. If we can't offer them a better way and say to them, like Jesus said to people, come, follow me. Jesus could say to the woman at the well, if you knew who it was who asked you to give him a drink, you would have said to him, give me a drink. And he says, I would have given you living water. I would give you something better than you could give me. Jesus says to his disciples, if any of you leave all of your possessions and relations for my sake and the gospel's sake, you will have 10 times as many brothers, sisters, and so on. Jesus offered them a better way, a way that he could manifest was truly better. They could tell it was better by his personality, by his spirit, by his wisdom, by his true happiness. The people who listened to him and who saw him could tell that his way was happier and better than their way. And they wanted to join him so that they could enjoy the benefits of a superior life. Do you offer an example? Do you offer a view of that superior life to your neighbors? Or is your religion merely theory and political talk? Maybe you're the reason why your neighbors don't want to be Christians, because they look at you and they say, what is there to have in Christianity? What does Christianity even offer? Look at this guy. Why would I choose to go and join him? He's got as many problems as I do. He's as screwed up as I am. He criticizes me, and yet what does he have to offer? No one's going to listen to this political talk. Now, one of the problems with homosexuality, I'm going to cut this off quickly. One of the problems with homosexuality is that, as I said before, I hinted at this, but I think it's important. Many people who claim to be homosexuals are simply young adults who are growing up and they're confused. They have a society that tells them that if they're not interested in marriage or in heterosexual relationships, they must be homosexuals. And so you could have a 14-year-old girl or a 17-year-old girl who is not interested in boys, not interested in sexual activity, and likes to hang out with girls. Isn't interested in being a wife or a mother. Likes to play soccer, likes to study, likes to draw, likes to dance or sing. Has other interests, isn't interested in heterosexual relationships, and hangs out with girls, likes to hang out with girls. Our society, the militant homosexuals in our society, will tell that girl that her desires and her interests prove that she is actually a homosexual. They'll teach her that. They'll tell her that. And she'll listen to them. And she'll begin to say, you know what, I think you're actually right. Maybe I am a homosexual. You don't like boys, right? No, I don't like boys. You don't want to get married, right? No, I don't want to get married. You like hanging out with girls, right? Yeah, I like hanging out with girls. You'd rather be with girls than boys, right? Yeah, I would rather be with girls than boys. Oh, well, then you're a homosexual. They're told to classify themselves. They're told what their desires mean. Those desires are interpreted for them by unbelievers. And they're told that now that you've identified as a homosexual, now that you have labeled yourself and accepted this classification, now it's time for you to start acting like a homosexual. It's time for you to start practicing homosexuality. And then if the girl says, well, I don't really know if that's what I am interested in. Oh, so you're not courageous. Oh, so you're in the closet. Oh, so you're afraid or ashamed of who you are. Oh, so you're controlled by others. Oh, you're not free and courageous like us. And you can see how it begins with an interpretation that's false, which can be received, and then one classifies oneself and accepts this classification. And then once the classification is accepted, the pressure is put on the person to start acting like what you are. Be what you are. And what's funny about this is that this mirrors Christianity. Because Christianity works in the same way. We start by leading someone to understand and believe and know, like Jesus taught, that we're God's children. God created us to know Him, to love Him, and to serve Him. He created us to be with Him forever. He created us to be holy. And when we come to faith and are baptized, we're now told, you are a child of God. You now need to live like a child of God. You need to grow into Christ-likeness. You need to put on the Lord Jesus Christ and be what you are. This is the same idea that's taught to homosexual people. Or I shouldn't even say homosexual people. I think you know what I mean. But there are kids being taught that their desire to simply not marry, or their desire or preference to spend time with people of the same sex, is proof that they belong to a certain artificial genus of human beings, and once they are willing to accept that classification, they're then pressured to act like homosexuals. And then we have this whole artificial, flamboyant homosexuality that's taught and practiced and learned. So are there true, depraved, reprobate homosexuals? Yes. But there are also, I believe, a far greater majority of people who are being manipulated, brainwashed, and pressured into accepting this classification and lifestyle, which always leads, if you pay attention and actually know people, which then leads as a necessary step into alcoholism, drugs. Those are necessary aids, just as the Christian needs the grace of the sacraments and the gifts of the Holy Spirit, so this immoral culture needs the graces of their alcohol and drugs to bring someone to perfection in the way of sin. And I believe that much of this talk of homosexuality is fake. I believe that much of it is false. I believe many of these young people who are talking about these things are brainwashed and confused. And because we have no philosophical teaching in our society, our children can't understand something like platonic love or platonic relationships, where people simply love other people, like David loved Jonathan in the Old Testament, said his love was greater than that of a woman. That true spiritual friendship or true platonic love, these things aren't taught. And so when someone has an experience like this, that when there's a profound intimacy between two people of the same sex, our pornographic society immediately shoves them into the homosexual category and commands that they act like homosexuals, when that's not even necessarily what they're experiencing. What they're experiencing could be very real and could be perfectly innocent. But they're actually pressured to accept behavior that's not essential to the things that they're thinking, feeling, experiencing, etc. Lastly, and I'm going to close with this, many of the arguments Christians make against homosexuality condemn their own religious. When we visit a monastery or a convent, those of us who are Christian and spiritually minded can understand the purpose and the nature of religious life. We can walk into a place where only women live. And when you're there, everyone will notice that it feels kind of strange to be with men who live together in a community with no women. You'll notice that these men are different. They're different. These women are different. And these women have a lot of characteristics that, if left in the world, would begin to be pressured with this talk of homosexuality, both men and women. And this is part of the problem with this vocations crisis, is that we've almost come to a point where we've accepted the idea that anyone who wants to be religious is gay, or may be gay. And men who have these feelings, not homosexual feelings, but simple spiritual desires, men who aren't interested in heterosexual relationships or activity, which is perfectly fine. Again, they're led into these dilemmas with people telling them that they may be homosexuals. And the idea of there being a religious manhood that's not effeminate and doesn't appear homosexual doesn't exist in our society. It's hard to find. And a life among women who live together in a convent, to understand what it means to be a woman who's not a wife or a mother or a daughter, but who lives as an independent adult woman with no relationship with men and who doesn't act like a lesbian, is difficult to understand what, positively speaking, that life should be. And so the religious are often awkward, because our religious communities, unlike those of the past, lack the philosophical foundation that would have existed in societies where Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy were known and taught, and a life outside of marriage, even in a secular life, would have clear goals and objectives and culture, and wouldn't be assumed to be homosexual. This is one of the consequences of classical philosophy being removed from our society. We have no explanation for people who are not interested in heterosexual relationships. We don't know what to do with them. We have no explanation for what they are unless they enter a seminary or a convent. And this is the fault of our society for having no philosophy, having no higher relationship among men than marriage. This is also a Protestant result. By Protestants denying religious vocations and arguing that marriage is the highest calling of the Christian life, anybody who chooses to not marry is a weirdo. And this creates this awkward, confused, am I a homosexual culture that our society doesn't have answers for. And for people who find themselves in that position, they're tormented for years and years by this confusion, because there's no positive philosophy for them to follow, no positive culture for them to embrace. Because if they don't marry, something's weird. Maybe they're gay. And we put this pressure on people in our society. So I think these things are more complicated than Christians are willing to admit, especially those who rush into political controversies that are ignorant and destructive, reckless, really. I think we have to always remind ourselves that our mission is to lead people to baptism, to lead people into the grace of God through the gospel, and that we should never try to interpret anyone's life or judge anyone's life who's outside of the faith. We should concentrate all of our effort and attention on leading them to faith, by setting a good example of a supernatural life for them to admire and desire, by speaking to them spiritually in humility, acknowledging that it's by grace that we're saved, not of works, by teaching them that Christ came into the world to save sinners, by speaking to them Christ's words of comfort, hope, salvation, by explaining to them original sin, the corruption of our nature, why we feel and think the way we do, the fact that our corruption is real, that we live inclined to sin, that's real, and that Christ came into the world to provide us with the strength that we need and the forgiveness that we need to overcome that corruption, to be reconciled to God and to enjoy everlasting life. If we're not sharing that with our neighbors, what in the world are we sharing? Some ugly political position? Once a person is brought into the faith, then if we simply continue the work of teaching them to obey all that Christ commanded, if their heart is changed by the Holy Spirit actually dwelling in them and making them to become a new creature, we're not going to have to worry about their political activity. We're not going to have to worry about these moral issues. The Holy Spirit will set everything right within them. And that's why, rather than take up all these political arguments, we should just listen to Jesus, who told us, go into the world and make disciples. God bless.